do.
I don't think Lindsay and Fredrik do, so you may want to share it real quick.
You're live.
Well, we are live now, and we're going to do some quick intros. We're going to go reverse order, and welcome to the green room, where we're talking about, crypto NFTs. Just kidding. Oh my God, what a crash! But let's do reverse intros. Where are you calling in from? What are you talking about? David, what's going on?
Yep, great to be here, Ray and Vala. We're going to do the Everything Space episode of DisrupTV, where we're talking about how space laws and norms are changing with commercial satellites, what commercial satellites are capable of with AI, and then what does this mean for companies that are trying to operate in the disrupted world.
Very cool. Thank you. And you're in DC, so.
Exactly.
What are we talking about today? What's going on, and where are you calling in from?
Oh, Fredrik, over to you.
Yeah, so it broke up a little bit there. So we are going to talk today about SpaceCloud, how we actually now have transferred the terrestrial cloud into space so that you can have seamless data interaction with space, just the same way you do with terrestrial cloud. And that really changes the way we do business in space, but it also transforms how you can leverage your satellite infrastructure.
Excellent. And Lindsay, what are we talking about today?
Hi, my name is Lindsay Rodman. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C. And today I'm going to talk about space law. There isn't very much of it. Space norms, we don't really have those either, and what that means for the future.
This is space, not cyberspace, nor the metaverse. So we're talking about real space law.
Right.
All right, cool. Well, hey, back to you, Al. Let's kick it off.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us on DisrupTV. My name is Vala Afshar. I'm the Chief Digital Evangelist at Salesforce and your co-host for the next hour. We welcome you to follow us on Twitter at DisrupTV Show. Send Ray, myself, our distinguished guests your questions live using hashtag DisrupTV, and we'll do our best to answer them in the next hour. It's my pleasure to introduce my co-host, Ray Wang. He's the CEO and founder of Constellation Research. He's the best-selling author of Everybody Wants to Rule the World, Surviving and Thriving in a World of Digital Giants. Ray's a regular television business and technology contributor on Fox Business, Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg, CNBC, and Wall Street Journal. I see him on TV almost daily. He's a global sought-after keynote speaker and one of the most influential futurists to follow on Twitter at RWANG0. Welcome, Ray Wang, to DisrupTV.
Hey, thanks a lot. I'm here with my awesome co-host, Vala Afshar, the Chief Digital Evangelist at Salesforce. He's also the author of The Pursuit of Social Business Excellence. Executives around the world pay attention to every one of his inspirational and insightful tweets when he's not hosting, keynoting, or leading events at Salesforce. You can find him speaking on business TV outlets such as Bloomberg and, of course, posting insightful analyses on ZDNet. But as you know, it's not about us. It's about our amazing guests. And who do we have to kick it off today?
It's our privilege to have Lindsay Rodman, Global Fellow at the Stimson Center. Lindsay is a former adjunct senior fellow within the Military Veterans and Society program at the Center for a New American Society. Lindsay joined the Marine Corps in 2008, where she served as an active duty judge advocate. Lindsay also served on the Joint Staff as Deputy Legal Counsel within the Office of the Legal Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lindsay spent her last year on active duty as a White House Fellow, placed at the National Security Council as Director for Defense Policy and Strategy. She continues to serve as a major in the Marine Corps Reserves. After leaving the Marine Corps, Lindsay joined the Obama administration, first as special assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, and then as senior advisor international humanitarian policy within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Lindsay is a fellow and resident at the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa, and a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. I had to shorten Lindsay's bio to a third because we only have an hour. She's done so much. You can follow Lindsay on Twitter at Lindsay Rodman, LindsayL Rodman, R-O-D-M-A-N. Welcome, Lindsay, to DisrupTV.
Thank you. Sorry for the bear of a bio there.
You're amazing. That's all I have to say.
No, you're a total rock star, and we're really excited. I've never had a space marine lawyer on our show. You are the first, and probably one of the biggest pioneers here. And what does that mean, right? What experiences do you have to actually create this juxtapositioning of roles? And what is a space marine lawyer? Let's start there.
Yeah, so that's not a real thing. I mean, it's what I call myself, but I may be one of one. When I was serving in the chairman's office, and I should say that I really want to make sure that I do the standard disclaimer that my comments are my own. I'm not here representing the Department of Defense or the Marine Corps or anyone's opinions except for my own. But when I was serving in the chairman's office, I had the opportunity to jump on some space law issues. And it's a joint office, so it doesn't really matter what service you're in. And typically, I mean, now we've got the Space Force that came out of the Department of the Air Force. But I happened to be a Marine lawyer, and I happened to jump on those issues and thought they were really interesting. And later in my career, as I went over to the White House and I worked on some defense policy issues, space came up again. I wasn't the primary person doing that portfolio, but because I had some experience in space, I was able to sort of jump in on some issues there. And then I got assigned to NATO as a Marine lawyer. And once again, because I had just a little bit of experience in space, all of a sudden I became the space lawyer and got to answer some really cutting edge issues that NATO was looking at as NATO declared space to be a new operational domain, and to think about what did that mean in terms of the application of international law, and particularly in that context, the law of war to space. So I got some really broad exposure there. And in my civilian career, after leaving active duty in the Marine Corps, I had an amazing opportunity to be on the sort of founding team of the Bolden Group, which is a consultancy that Charlie Bolden, his son, founded. Che Bolden, he's the CEO, with Charlie Bolden as a senior advisor and a member of the board. That's really thinking about cultivating and transforming leadership for the new space economy in a way that is inclusive, forward-looking, and hopefully will inure to all our benefits.
That's amazing. I mean, I just think about the last year, Virgin Atlantic and Amazon and SpaceX and the private sector, just incredible innovation and exciting, I don't know if it's democratization, access to space, but seems like incredible amount of energy and investments in this space. And as a lawyer, there may not be any precedents in terms of, I mean, this is really blue ocean work. What are your biggest concerns and perhaps even opportunities regarding space law and space norms when you think about the next 5-10 years?
I love that you ask about opportunities because normally when lawyers start talking about space, there's kind of two camps, right? There's the camp that says there's no law in space. It's all just the wild, wild west. The space west, and so anything's going to go, and that means chaos and anarchy. And then there's the other group that says, no, we have some laws, and what we need to do is honor them, and sort of build up norms around those laws because there's enough, and we'll be fine. And I actually think there's an enormous opportunity to say you're both right. There is some law in space, but there's really not a lot. The existing international laws in space are what's called the Outer Space Treaty Regime. It's 5 treaties that were all signed in the 60s and 70s. And that's basically it when it comes to international law. And, we didn't know in the 1970s what SpaceX was going to be doing in 2022. So they're not really fit for purpose in a lot of ways. I think it's a great starting point and building block. And people who say that we have nothing, I don't think that's right. We have a great foundation to build off of, but there isn't that much. And then the folks who say, hey, we've got plenty of regulation, don't regulate me more, that's not really true either. If we were to encounter real disputes or problems in space about liability or about who's bumping up against who's creating, damage to each other's satellites or even damage back on Earth based on what's happening in space, we really do not have a robust system to deal with those problems right now. And there's an incredible opportunity we have with all the excitement that folks have about disrupting in terms of new technologies. I think for law nerds, there's an opportunity to disrupt too, where we can start thinking about new institutions and new ways that we can create systems of accountability and enforcement in space.
And who enforces these laws, existing laws?
So really no one. And that's one of, I think, the problems with the Outer Space Treaty regime. There have been a couple of times that certain articles, Article 9, for example, have been challenged. And so the best example that people often point to is the anti-satellite testing that we saw most recently from China and Russia, but the United States is guilty too. We did it a bunch in the 80s. And if you are to create potential damage in space, there are obligations under the Outer Space Treaty in terms of what you're supposed to do, the way that you're supposed to inform everyone else. We never did it, and now Russia and China aren't doing it. And everyone kind of bends over backwards to distinguish what they're doing as being like, I don't know that we need to fit within the Outer Space Treaty regime. What that means, though, is that whenever we've had the chance to use the law for some kind of accountability enforcement, we haven't taken it. There's some other examples as well that I can get into if it's of interest, but we really haven't been applying them for accountability and enforcement. Aside from that, people like to point to this idea of norms, right? Norms in international law, not just in space, but just in general. People talk about norms as a way to try to get people to fall in line without having accountability and enforcement, because no one wants to give up the autonomy, right? We don't want to give up our sovereignty. We don't want to say that an American decision would then be subject to an international court's rulings. I understand that. And politically, that's carried the day in the United States. So instead, we do norms, which is where everyone kind of agrees on a principle, but without an enforcement mechanism. The problem with norms is that the enforcement mechanism in norms is public shame. Right?
Sure.
Right? So can I embarrass you? Do you have any shame? And I think we all know, I don't even need to name names. Some countries and some people do have shame and some don't. And for the ones who don't, often those are the ones we're trying to hold accountable anyway. So it really, we butt up against some problems there. So, what I'm really passionate about is trying to think through, are there ways that we can create institutions or systems of interdependence where we get that accountability and enforcement that we're kind of lacking right now?
And Lindsay, real quick, right? I think there's a couple laws, right? That there's like 5 treaties that are out there. I think some have to do with arms control, some have to do with exploration. Like there's a couple of treaties that are important, like damage or objects or safety or something. I mean, back to Vala's point on enforcement, right? Are there going to be more, and who's the body that directs this? Is it the UN, or is it these just bilateral treaties?
Yeah, so that's the Outer Space Treaty regime. It's 5 treaties, and you're exactly right. You've done your homework, which is awesome. But we don't use them. So I'll give another example. The Liability Convention says that anything that comes out of your territory and damages another country in space or on their territory. So let's say that you shoot something up and it falls on another country's territory. That includes anything that comes from your territory that the government doesn't own. So for example, if private companies are shooting stuff off of or launching things off of American territory and it lands on, say, Russian territory, then the United States government is liable for whatever damage happens there. Yeah. And that's only happened once, and it was a dispute between Canada and Russia. And what ended up happening was they actually settled outside of the outside of the Liability Convention. And so the significance of that is that no one uses these tools. Like, we have them, but people are bending over backwards not to use them. And, they atrophy over time. Like, people sort of stop looking to them as sources of inspiration or even real law in terms of accountability and enforcement. And then we start looking to other things. So that's where, right now, when you look in the private sector, everyone likes to talk about norms because it's like, okay, we don't have a lot of law. We just have these 5 treaties and they're not super relevant to some of the problems that we think that we're going to be facing in the future. Or there's just not a lot of meat on the bones. They say generally that we should all be collaborating, but not much more than that. So let's put some norms out there. And then again, the norms can only do so much work because what's going to stop people from defecting from the norms? Like public accountability, public shame for those who care about that. And for a lot of American corporations, that's going to be some level of accountability, right? But I think we all know that's not going to carry the day in really sticky situations.
All right, so we're talking about the future of space communications laws and norms. We're going to come back to you in about 20 minutes. We're going to bring in Fredrik to talk about what's happening in terms of SpaceCloud. So we'll bring in our next guest now. We'll bring you back on in, Lindsay. So give us a little bit.
Thank you, Lindsay. What a fascinating, our first space lawyer. That's pretty awesome. Our next guest is Dr. Fredrik Bruhn, Chief Evangelist and Digital Transformation at UNIBAP. Dr. Fredrik Bruhn has served in a variety of leadership, entrepreneurial, and research roles during the past 2 decades. He's currently Director and Chief Evangelist of UNIBAP, a Swedish scale-up democratizing space through its innovation SpaceCloud solutions, developed with support from European Space Agency. UNIBAP announced a partnership with AWS in December of 2020 to bring AWS cloud storage and edge services into SpaceCloud and launch the first NASA experiment on SpaceCloud January of this year, 2022. Dr. Bruhn has previously co-founded the satellite company AAC Microtech and the mobile surveillance robot company Rotundus AB. Dr. Bruhn served as an adjunct professor in robotics and avionics at Mallar-Dalen University since 2013. You can follow Dr. Bruhn on Twitter. This is really cool. Bruhn Space, BRUHN Space. Welcome, Dr. Bruhn, to DisrupTV.
Thank you very much. And I find it fascinating with Lindsay basically saying that there are no laws governing cloud computing in space. And we are actually doing cloud computing in space. And we have absolutely no idea who actually owns the data. So this is a classical example where technology is preceding the legislation.
Right.
Fredrik, that's amazing. We're going to do our data residency in space and nobody can come after us. But
or everyone will come after you.
Yeah, right.
They'll be like, hey, we need to set precedents. So SpaceCloud, what is the SpaceCloud, and what is that all about? Is it exactly what I'm thinking, like the cloud in space, or is there a lot more to this than we realize?
And I thought my company owned the coolest cloud names, but no, SpaceCloud is pretty awesome.
Yeah, so let's try to explain this piece by piece. So we started in 2013 with the goal of democratizing space. So if you're familiar with space, you know that we use some very weird processors and you have to develop the code every time and you have no basically code reuse, etc. So in 2013, we set out with AMD, a big American company in CPUs, to pursue an x86 server farm in space. And in 2016, we were able to launch the first x86-based servers into space and test the technology out. So for a number of years now, we've been flying PlayStation 4, and we will now use PlayStation 5 technology in space as well. And that gives us the ability to really have cloud computing in space. Now, obviously, when you look at space, you have radiation, so you cannot simply go to Radio Shack and buy a PlayStation 4 and launch it into space. That won't work. So we had to do a lot of tricks to be able to make an entire cloud infrastructure work in space. But we were able to do that, and from 2017, we have been establishing the SpaceCloud ecosystem where we are bringing in applications and software from terrestrial cloud into space. And all of this came into fruit last year in 2021 when we launched the first SpaceCloud compatible satellite. And we are now orchestrating different machine loads in space, just the same way you do in a terrestrial cloud. You upload containers, you tell the satellite when to orchestrate what container, you have S3 buckets and storage on board, you have CPUs, GPUs, neural network accelerators. So from a practical standpoint, it is a radiation-tolerant server infrastructure that can run any load that you have on ground. So if you have TensorFlow loads, you can do that. If you're using OpenCV, you can use that. If you're using Windows, you could even do that if you're crazy enough in space.
So you're talking about adjacent technologies like artificial intelligence or Internet of Things Are you able to provide these capabilities? From the response you just gave, it sounds like you can provide services leveraging IoT, machine learning, AI, and how much power does it take to do this, on a satellite?
So that really depends, of course, on what you're set out to do and the size of the satellite. But the ones that we've launched so far uses about 30 watts of power. And that is enough to be able for us to do, for instance, real-time flooding monitoring from space. We have demonstrated real-time airborne aircraft tracking capabilities. We have demonstrated that we can launch and run between 30 and 50 different applications per orbit, which means that you can really unlock the potential of the satellites, and you can serve customers with information created in space, in orbit, all the time. So instead of launching one satellite for one application, you can have one satellite for 1,000 applications now, because you can reconfigure the satellite with software. Just the same way we do on ground. It's just that we've been doing it on ground for about 15 years. So we are catching up to that now. So basically, your satellite looks to you as any IoT device on ground. You cannot really tell that it's in space.
And your customers, mostly government, military, or private sector, or is a combination?
It's a combination. Some of the publicly announced customers are obviously defense companies like Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon. But we've also announced customers like Planet Labs, Satellogic, for instance, and others. We are running experiments for NASA now as one example as well. So we're seeing a big interest from various areas. And you can imagine that if you're an insurance company and you're looking for flooding, and we can upload a machine learning application to tell you where you have flooding in real time, and only tell you that, you don't need to pay for anything else. You pay only for that data. That's a tremendous game changer. And an example of this is that we demonstrated this capability with the European Space Agency last year, and we were able to reduce the amount of data downlinked by 99.9%. And in space, the satellite data transmission is almost one-to-one to the cost. So we also reduced, obviously, the cost by 99.9% as well. But I think the most important piece is that we sent down the information within 5 minutes after acquisition. So rather than waiting hours or days, you have the result within minutes in your phone or wherever you would like to have the result.
I did my graduate thesis on measuring electron storm activity in the ionosphere. I believe the 5th layer of the atmosphere. I don't recall, but the U.S. Air Force had ground-based receivers on the east coast of the U.S., low-orbiting satellites, and they would feed us information. And I would use MATLAB software, and it would take us days, sometimes weeks, to compute the three-dimensional model of the electron storms. And the fact that you can now upload or download within minutes and capture activity in space is ridiculously cool. That's pretty awesome. That's really awesome. Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, it is. But I think one of the major and maybe the most important aspect of this is that you can now take any software developer from the cell phone industry and write apps that can be used in space. There are no more special compilers or weird processors with architectures you never heard of. It is an x86 infrastructure in space with a orchestration layer that is based on Docker in our case, but we've also tested K8s and things like that for Kubernetes. And with a MATLAB background, we have even had one case where you have uploaded M files to space and used MATLAB in space as well.
Well, the graphic capabilities of MATLAB and the fact that you can, auto-compile and create visuals instantly, it was a super powerful tool. So less time creating graphics, more time actually analyzing the data, which is pretty awesome. I can't believe I haven't talked about that was my graduate thesis. I can't believe this.
We learn something new every show. Amazing, But hey, we're gonna jump in, and we're gonna take you back in here in 10 minutes, Fredrik, and we're gonna bring in Dr. David Bray, and we're gonna talk a little bit about what's going on at the Stimson Center in terms of space and quantum communications and sensors. So let's go do that, and we'll bring you back in a bit, and then we'll have all three guests: Lindsay, Dr. Bray, and of course, we'll have Dr. Bruhn back in. So go ahead.
For all of our audience knows our next guest. He's a first ballot Hall of Fame inductee to Disrupt TV. He was on episode 3, and now we're on episode 280 something. So Dr. David Bray is Distinguished Fellow at Stimson Center and Principal at Lead to Adapt Ventures. Very short bio. Dr. Bray was named the Senior Fellow with the Institute of Human-Machine Cognition. Business Insider named him one of the top 24 Americans who are changing the world under 40. He was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum from 2016 to 2021. From 2017 to 20, Dr. Bray served as Executive Director for People-Centered Internet Coalition, chaired by the inventor of Internet, with Surf. And so welcome, Dr. Bray, welcome back to Disrupt TV.
Thanks for having me here, Vala and Ray. And as you've heard from both Lindsay and Fredrik, space is being disrupted as we speak in ways that are going to have impact here at home. And I think it's worth just sort of making sure that the Disrupt TV audience understands we right now have a little bit less than 7,000 satellites. And there are some stats that actually say that SpaceX has actually launched more satellites than any one company. So a commercial company has done more than any one government.
Wow.
But of those 7,000 satellites, give or take, we're going to be conservatively 100,000 or more in 8 years. So we're going from 7,000 to 100,000. It's going to raise interesting questions about what does that mean? Do privacy laws apply from observation taken from space? Are we okay with possibly political campaigns using tracking of both political candidates, but also possibly voter registration from space? What does this mean for open societies? We know already hedge funds are actually counting reflectivity of cars in parking lots to predict whether or not a store is going to do well or not going to do well. And so if you as a company are not thinking about your space engagement strategy, both on a public front, but also how you're using this for competitiveness in your business landscape, you should start now.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mean, you're touching upon these, right? The macro geopolitical trends that are important here in terms of things that we should be thinking about regarding space, especially when private companies and private sector companies are out there. I mean, what happens, for example, if we suddenly can't see through the atmosphere, right? I mean, is there a law on density in terms of how many satellites we can put up there, especially on low Earth orbits? But we're going to see stuff like that. But let's take the geopolitical piece, right? I mean, the two big players in the space right now are China. Actually 3, EU and the US, and soon UAE, and others are going to be jumping into this. So what's
India?
going on the geopolitical side?
Yeah, well, that's just it. It's getting more and more crowded. I mean, let's not forget UAE. UAE successfully not only launched a rocket, but they actually sent a satellite to Mars. And so increasingly, we're going to see both nation state actors that you would not have thought about being involved in space, but also non-state entities. I mean, what does it mean when conservatively SpaceX is launching 30,000 satellites by the end of 2030? Bezos will have 30,000 as well, and then China will have 30,000. And what are you going to do when maybe it has to be a three-way call between Musk, Bezos, and China to say one of your satellites is going to bump into our satellites, and we only have 1 hour to figure out who's going to move what? And so, because people don't realize if a collision happens in space, we could very well not be able to use space for another 75 years. And so the stakes are high if a collision happens in space, in that we can make it so it's not usable.
Or if you decide to blow up a satellite and leave the debris.
Oh, yeah, like we've never seen an actor that recently, one that is currently in a war in Ukraine, maybe blow up a satellite just to show that they could do it. And also possibly hack satellites as well, which seems to be the case of Viasat.
Space. Yeah. Can I take out your space with your satellite with my laser? Is there a treaty against that?
Well, and on that note, actually, just this week, a country of 1.4 billion people demonstrated that they have an AI that has been trained. It's a technology that can actually destroy satellites, but it will actually deceive the satellites into thinking they're not being hunted and then proceed to destroy them. And so when you're actually, if you've seen the movie War Games, now we're actually dealing with the fact that we're going to have AIs doing targeting of satellites. If things ever got hot and we wanted to actually sort of have a tit for tat, do we need to be worried that AI will be behind the scenes making the decisions whether or not to shoot down a satellite?
It's
Wow.
so amazing what nefarious states can do by watching American movies. But anyways, back to you, Vala.
Okay.
So what you need is we need more we need more non-dystopian movies. We need to have
Yes.
a film that gives us hope. But I think that does get to the point, which is, I mean, we can now say food supply chains, water supply chains, just global supply chains in aggregate. And as you heard from Fredrik, I mean, data and cloud, these things will now be linked to space. And so really what I think, and this is, I'd be interested in Lindsay's thoughts on this as well, what we really need to do in the absence of any space law, we need to make it so that everybody's incentivized to preserve space, because otherwise you may not be able to feed your people any more than we're going to be able to feed our people too, that our stakes are linked together. And so if we see it as a win-win, that might be, you know, again, going back to war games, you know, the only option to win is to not to play at all.
Yeah, yeah. As I'm listening to you guys talk about movies, I'm thinking about what I'm going to see Top Gun, the new one, and how many. And I know it's not quite space, but you know, it's close enough. Okay, so you talked about 7,000 satellites growing in order of magnitude to 100,000. Of the 7,000 that are there, like how are we leveraging these satellites to help with? You mentioned, you know, the war that's happening in Ukraine, or climate change, or food shortages. Like, what are some of these big issues that we're facing, and how is this technology and innovation being used to help us perhaps address some of these concerns we have?
Right. So most of the satellites at the moment are communication satellites. And you probably have seen some articles about what SpaceX might have been doing to help Ukraine. Yeah. I actually did some commentary which said, you know, we need to also make sure we don't get anybody targeted, because ground stations can be targeted. And so the last thing you want to do is have someone near it and then you figure out their location. Right. But it is helping with connectivity in that region. In terms of the other satellites, some of them are able to do what's called remote sensing or imaging. And we know, for example, we can pick up large methane gas plumes. And in fact, there was a large methane gas plume that was released by Russia recently that was sort of in violation of climate change accords. And so we can hold people and countries accountable when it comes to environmental, and that's interesting. And then there's also the ability to actually understand, and Fredrik will be able to talk a little bit more when he comes back, where's flooding at risk, as we know that climate change is going to be happening. Where is the place that you need to actually start thinking in advance of maybe they're not growing enough crops, and also just holding people accountable. I will share at the Stimson Center, there's a project right now with the Mekong Delta, large country of 1.4 billion people. Again, China has been known to sort of dam the Mekong. And the trouble is they won't tell people when they're going to either release a large amount of water or they're going to hold back a large amount of water. And that has implications on countries that are further south of the Mekong Delta. And so what the Stimson Center has right now is a combination of people on flip phones when they see the water level suddenly drop, but then also satellite footage. And then they can turn to that large country and say, did you forget to tell us something? And that sort of peer pressure approach is a way to sort of hold them accountable. And the first time they were very embarrassed. And now it's actually a sort of way of trying to encourage people to play well in terms of normative behavior by using the peer pressure effect from imagery from space.
Wow.
So it does give you hope that we may figure out new ways of governing.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that I really want to see, and I know we talked about this on the program last week too, I'm worried that space is only going to benefit a few. It's going to be sort of very lopsided in the benefits. I'd love to see local community efforts. You know, we heard from Sharon about our Green Jobs Machine, but ideas of going to the local level to understand what they need, what their goals are, and then link it to what's possible through space data. So you have the win-win in the local context, in that the local context isn't telling you what they're seeing, what they need. And it's actually possibly also making the satellites better, because the satellites might think they see something like it's not growing well, or they're not growing these crops for this reason. But when you talk to local people, you have that better context, and it becomes this virtuous win-win cycle for the big satellite companies, but also for local communities.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it true that for any breakthrough new innovation technology, you essentially served a few at the beginning and then over time increase scale and access?
It is. That generally happens. The challenge is it usually takes 50 years for it to become more equitable. It also generally takes between 15 and 25 years to figure out the ethics. One might say social media, we're coming out of the first we thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. We're going through a process of disillusionment, and then we're still now figuring out the ethics of social media. I don't think we have the luxury of waiting 50 years for this to become more equitable in its benefits. And so what can we do to sort of jumpstart and accelerate? Maybe tie it to UN SDGs or something like that. But I think if we're not intentional about trying to find more equitable community benefits, we're going to end up super empowering autocracies and be surprised that open society. I mean, you can just imagine what's going to happen in open societies when political opponents are taking satellite footage of their other opponent. I mean, that is troublesome.
Yeah.
Or even just like, do we want to see a divorce case in 2030 where the aggrieved party says, you said you were going to the grocery store, but per the satellite footage, we know you were going over and having an affair over here. I mean, I personally don't want to see that future.
Yeah.
But the best way to prevent that future from happening is to create a better one.
I wouldn't mind tracking Ray's whereabouts in the future, because most of the time I don't know if he's in space or on Earth. I'd like to get Lindsay and Dr. Bruhn back on the panel, because you gently reference UN SDGs.
Yes.
And the thought in my mind is, if you fast forward 5 to 10 years, can we anticipate an 18th, 19th, 20th SDG added, which speaks to norms or expected behaviors and opportunities in space?
So I will defer to Lindsay on that, but I'll give my preview and then go to Lindsay and then Fredrik. I would love to see space baked into the existing SDGs as opposed to new ones. I already think there are too many, but I'd like to go through each one of them and say, what are the norms of behavior that we want to see associated with, say, food or with water or in the different SDGs as we go through it?
Yeah, let's go to Lindsay. So Lindsay, what do you got?
I think that sounds right. So much about what space enables for the average person, the average American, the average global citizen is not about brand new capabilities. It's about enhancing how we live our everyday lives. So, improving access to water and health and information about climate and weather, sort of everyday human security type issues can be improved through space. And so building that into the existing SDGs makes a lot of sense to me. And thinking about space in that context is great. The UN is really the natural place to be thinking about bringing the global community together to have these conversations. I will add, when we have these conversations with big tech companies or in American-dominated venues, saying that the UN is the right forum for this conversation is a laugh line. David was present when I said this, and it was a laugh line at a recent.
And a company to remain nameless.
So we've got some work to do to think about. The UN is the natural place to start. It's the place where you get the global South to have a voice at the table, and they're really not going to be well represented if you don't go there. So the question is, can we reinvigorate that forum? Or if we're going to create new institutions and new forums, which isn't on its face a terrible idea, you really need to prioritize inclusion.
Yeah, this is going to be a tough issue. And as we see how, laws tie back to data, tie back to the internet, right? I mean, this is something that's happening right now. And so the question is, what other disruptions are we going to see in the next 5 years? Where will you see these disruptions take place? And does it create new business models? Does it create new freedoms that we don't know about? Do we have to protect existing freedoms? I'll start with you, David, and then go to Fredrik.
So I think one of the disruptions that I think, it's not going to be Web3. Web3 is still in search of
Web5 now, according to Jack Dorsey.
I'm not riding that hype train, but I think we're a combination of both what space will enable, but also quantum, and not just quantum computing. Everyone rushes to quantum computing. I think it's going to be quantum communications, quantum sensing. The quantum revolution is going to happen. However, for open societies, this gets to the point of how do we do equity and inclusion? Because again, I'm worried that it's going to be lopsided. And I think we're going to have to figure out how we work with partners that are multinational in nature, because otherwise it's just 330 million people in the United States versus an autocracy of 1.4 billion that may have alternative futures. So I would love to be working with not just Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand on these activities. I'd like to be working with Sweden, nod to Fredrik over there, and Finland, as well as Japan and Germany, and possibly India, because this is really about open societies trying to figure out how they use these technologies to benefit everyone, not just a few. And if we do it by ourselves, we'll all hang separately, but we really need to figure out how we do it together.
Yeah, and we're seeing free. I mean, even the notion of open society might be very controversial inside the U.S. So when we say free Western democracies or free people, I mean that's maybe different in terms of improving.
I'm not. I'm saying open society because I want to include Singapore, and I know Singapore might see certain words as a lightning rod. So yes,
It's very true. Very, very true there. What are you seeing, Fredrik, on this line? So, I mean, space cloud governance. You know.
It's so interesting because on Earth we have the internet and everyone can communicate on internet because it uses TCP/IP, a standard protocol, and you can build your services on top of that. Now, when we will have the same in space, you can have interoperability between satellites. So you can have American satellites interoperable with Chinese satellites. But do we want that? But what we will definitely see is a space-based internet that allows you to reason between satellites in space. You can have business models that fusion data between 10 different satellites with 8 different sensors, for instance. You can send up different tasks. You can have autonomous mission planning. All those things that requires a tremendous amount of effort on ground today will be done in space. And that in turn will open up the possibility to basically generate any data product at any time. And given that input, we are going, as David elaborated, we are going to see a very different use of space. You can hold people accountable to a completely different new level, but obviously you could also do warfare in a new way as well.
Yeah, and you guys are talking about things from onboard satellite image processing, from forest fires to agriculture, like the precision farms, to oil spill detection, to like any kind of like earthquakes or hurricane activity that's coming up there. I mean, these are pretty interesting developments that are going there. I mean, who's ready to embrace this? Are people jumping in right now, Fredrik?
Absolutely. We're seeing a tremendous uptick in this, but there is still a level of education because most people that has been buying data products from space has today been buying a satellite with a sensor, and you've been buying the raw data and then you process the data on ground. So now when you have the ability to actually buy data points, and you don't need to specify that it should be a hyperspectral or a SAR radar or a LiDAR, etc. You specify, I would like to know this. And we don't care if you fuse it between 5, 10, 100 different satellites. The market changes tremendously because you are buying data just the same way you do on ground.
So the other thing I would just say real quick on building on what Fredrik just said, Ray, I think the other thing we need to think about is two things, and this gets to Lindsay's norms. One, these satellites are moving incredibly fast. And so no one's going to be able to yank the hard drives if the hard drives either have a case of ransomware or something on them that they're not supposed to. That's going to be an interesting question of what's our response plan when the first ransomware attack happens on a commercial satellite, especially because it's not just that satellite, but essentially if that satellite becomes a paperweight and crashes into another one, major issues. The other question, though, is I don't want to see happen is a fully encrypted satellite network that is the new Silk Road in space, and it's doing nefarious activities that we don't have any insights into. I'm all for privacy of communications and everything like that, but we got to figure out how do we, and the question is whose law of compliance applies, but how do we make sure there's not human trafficking or small arms terrorist financing happening in space in encrypted comms?
Okay, my question is for all three of you. Because thousands of people are watching you now, this weekend you're going to get a call from Mr. Bezos and Mr. Musk, both of them offering you space travel, and you have to choose only one. And I'll start with Lindsay. Which one would you choose if you chose any, and why? One is a 3-day, inspiration for multiple orbits of Earth. The other, I think, you go up for about 10 minutes and you come back down.
This is like the, sort of choosing between two, I don't know, evils. I mean, my answer is neither. But I'm going to go Bezos because he strikes me as the less of a chaos agent. And the one thing that I worry about in space is like there's enough chaos up there. We're trying to figure out how to impose some order on some systems right now.
Okay, that makes sense. And neither is a perfect answer, you know. But and if I had to bet, I would have thought that the Marine would have chose to spend as long as possible in space. But I definitely understand your answer for sure. Dr. Bray, which one?
I would actually go online and auction off the ticket to a good cause, and whichever ticket was the best is what I would do. So, I mean, I would give up.
You look like you're in space right now. I can't believe it.
I'm here. There's no COVID. There's no COVID in space. It's great.
Okay, that's a great answer. That's a great answer. Dr. Bruhn.
This is a very tough call, but I would probably opt to go with Musk and stay in space for a while, but I would still work for a better good for space. But being able to go into space, experience that, would give me an ability to work towards a better use for space. And I must agree also with Lindsay that neither of these gentlemen seems to be having Earth as the primary focus of their activities.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that we would love to get a phone call from anybody about is how can we be more people and community centric in our space activities? Because if we don't do that, we may have a replicate, we may repeat what the railroad tycoons did about 120 years ago.
Dr. Bray, how old is Dylan?
Dylan is 5 and he loves space.
So
especially
Dylan,
black holes.
So, Dylan, do you think in Dylan's life we'll get close to Musk's vision of multiplanetary inhabitants?
That's an interesting thing. I think the limiting factor is actually going to be the human body. And so, I think it's quite possible we will, we've already got robotic vehicles on Mars and things like that. I think in order to go beyond that and actually stay there, we're going to have to figure out what are we okay with in terms of updating the human body to exist outside of a planet that is the current gravity that we have, is the current atmosphere we have, and everything like that.
So biological limitations.
Oh yeah, we know like human eyes very quickly start to dry. Yeah, exactly. It's not a technological limitation. It really is human bodies were not built to operate outside of the planet we're currently on.
Yeah, the level of mods that are coming, the material science that's there, the biochemistry and the biomedical engineering, bioengineering that's going on for space to be full-time is going to be quite interesting. It's really, the notion of being human is about to be pushed to the limits as to what will human be. And then also what we're seeing in the level of automation and AI for space. I mean, a lot of the things that we need to be done are going to be fully automated and basically built on systems that are going to run on the SpaceCloud. I mean, if you think about what it is, these are all primary infrastructures, first principles that have to be in place before we can even get there. I mean, just basic oxygen production, like how do we get consistent oxygen, consistent energy, consistent
So when we talk about laws and norms, is this like FDA approved to be in space? Or how do you
there is no. So I think you hit the nail on the head for another disruptive. We have to talk about synthetic biology. I mean, because synthetic biology is happening as we speak on Earth, not even in space. And some of the space applications include, for example, you can actually build more pristine fiber optic cable in space than you can here on Earth. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the early ways that it's going to sort of be profitable. But I imagine there'll also may be some synthetic biology advancements where it proves better to build it in a zero-G or a low-gravity environment. But you've hit the nail on the head. Is not only do we have the quantum revolution happening, not only do we have the space revolution happening, we've got in parallel the synthetic biology revolution. And you talk about challenges of norms. I mean, Lindsay would know better. I mean, we can go back to biological war conventions, but other than that, synthetic biology is going to be very interesting very fast.
I want to go to a point Vala was making earlier, and it's really about enforcement. Lindsay, like, what happens with enforcement? If we have laws that cannot be enforced, like, what do we do? I mean, those aren't they usually just ignored? Like, what do you do when you can't enforce treaties or enforce rules? Like,
and shaming doesn't work. Then what do you do?
Shaming doesn't work. And I mean, we're talking about this in the metaverse as well. Like the same problem. Like the rules and the laws don't exist, right? I mean, who do you sue and who's liable for something?
Right. And the problem that we have in space is actually not just like, what happens when you go against the rules, but there's no there are no rules, right? Like, so my presumption about what the rules should be in space, what I think of as being sort of neighborly conduct in space, may not align with what China thinks fair use of space should look like. For example, just to to throw an example out there. So this is some of the work that people are trying to do with norms development, is just getting people on the same page and thinking about, what could we think about being the rules? Even domestically, it's really, really hard to get multilateral international treaties these days. They're just almost never signed. They, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that was how you did it. And it worked to some extent. There's a sort of history of colonialism and lack of inclusion and in how we approach that. But for the most part, it was constructive, especially when it comes to things like the Outer Space Treaty Regime. There isn't a lot of hope. Like, the US government position is that we're not even going to try. We want to just pursue norms in space and not international law, because we think we can get further along those lines in terms of getting everyone on the same page. But then your problem of enforcement becomes exactly it. So what we need is
who has the biggest tactical high energy laser wins, or who's got,
well,
that old, what was that magneto hydro something explosive munition? I forget what that was. So.
Yeah, I mean, what we need is systems of interdependence, right? So like the accountability comes from things like the International Space Station, where you have historic collaboration among nations that might be bickering about other stuff on Earth. But we have created the incentive structure such that no one wants to defect. And we are reliant upon each other. And space is actually a public, there's actually a sort of legal argument about whether space is a global commons or not. I won't bore you with the details of that. But the questions are, in what ways is space a global commons like the ones that we experience on Earth, and what ways is it different? And one of the ways that David kind of alluded to earlier is that the potential, when you talk about disruption, the potential to disrupt space and really just take it off the playing field for us for an extended period of time is much larger. Like, we can pollute the oceans and sort of ruin it for everyone, but to really take that off the table forever is not, we don't really foresee that happening. It's happening slowly, but not, with the same urgency. So there really is an incentive for us all to collaborate. And what we need to figure out is ways that we can talk to each other. I think a really great place to start would be talking about space debris, because no one wants there to be space debris. Everyone agrees we should be doing something about it. Most of the potential solutions are sort of unobjectionable. And so that would be a really, really constructive way to put heads together and have people start doing the work of showing what collaboration can look like in space outside of the International Space Station.
And there is no space debris consortium that exists that's international and focused on. Dr. Bray's laughing.
Oh, I'm just thinking interstellar garbage collectors of the planet Earth.
There are companies who are doing this and who are, creating this technology. I'm familiar with a couple of startups that are trying to do that type of work. But really, it's also just a question about, like, who's responsible for what, who's going to pay for it, right? Wow. So you really want to kind of band together and have everyone agree about that. And, I'll add that we do have some lessons to learn about the metaverse and the big tech experience here. The, big tech companies, startups, they hate regulation, they hate laws, they love the idea that it's the wild, wild west. It's like very sexy and, tech bro culture, right? But what we've seen in terms of where we are now with some of these big tech companies is now they're looking back and saying, oh, we actually agreed on a lot of stuff that could have been regulated ex ante, and we would have benefited from it had we actually gone down that road and put our heads together. And the US government probably would have done whatever we'd asked them to do in terms of regulation. Now you look like bad actors and like you've been misbehaving, and now it looks punitive. So my hope is that we can take that lesson into space and think about ways that, folks who are major players in space now can put heads together and come up with some really good ideas about how we can all sign up for some rules that will inure to everyone's benefit.
Which non-space industries should care most about the conversation we just had for the past hour? Is it food, agriculture? Like, who's going to benefit most from understanding? And all three of you are in front of CXOs across multiple industries, I suspect. I know Dr. David Bray that's probably daily ritual. What do you tell these folks? What do you tell these CEOs or CMOs or whatever, chief technology officers, in terms of this is disruption that's happening in the space industry, and this is how it's going to impact you, and this is why you should care? Can you tell us which industries should be really carefully paying attention to what's happening in space?
I'll jump on one, and then I'll be interested in Fredrik and Lindsay. I would say banks, because this is going to impact. This is how you impact lending. This is how you're going to do adjustments, insurance. This is how you're going to do assessments. I mean, the future, Vala, if you ever need to do a claim, is we'll have the satellite fly by and see if that claim actually happened or not. We'll actually assess it on the fly. And in 30 minutes or less, your claim will be adjudicated. So I think banks got to care about this. It'll also impact how they make loans to telecommunications or to data centers or things like that. But I would say banks are going to be the most disrupted by space.
Wow.
That's huge.
And if we continue down that path, I would say energy and food supply. And I think to Lindsay's comment, I'm pessimistic. I don't think we will see any self-governing in space until we fight out the first war on the moon. And that will be regarding minerals, and it will be helium-3 for the nuclear power plants of the future, the fusion reactors.
Wow.
So hopefully we won't have to see that, but I don't think we will see regulation until we have the first war on the moon.
Well, that's one of the scary pieces, right? I mean, this helium-3 mining on the lunar surface is going to pick up, right? And that's really the battle of who can actually colonize the moon first and start production, right? About getting those energy sources as the moon is the launch pad, right? And without any rules and regulations, it's kind of scary. Lindsay, what's your thoughts on as to what the industries that matter or will be disrupted most?
I mean, I'm going to pick the really obvious one, which is communications. I mean, duh, I know. But really, when it comes to communications, we are not just, needing to pay attention to what happens in space, but becoming so singularly reliant on space that the question about what happens to our communication, should we lose space, if there's a cybersecurity breach that impacts space, that's actually where you have the biggest potential swings in terms of capability across the board in any sector.
Wow. We've been doing this show for almost 7 years. I never thought first war on the moon would be something that I would hear on DisrupTV. That's talk about the true essence of disruption. Wow. Go ahead, Ray. I apologize for interrupting.
I was gonna say, look, I mean, we're entering many pioneering areas, right? The real space versus the metaverse versus more bioethics, right? A lot of things haven't been discovered. We're missing frameworks, right? And I think it's going to be very, very important for frameworks and intercooperation to come into play. And we need more institutions to be stronger to be able to pull people together. You three have been working really hard to do that, and it's really been a pleasure and honor to have you here today, because this is the future of the future. And it starts with the intercooperation, it starts with the framework, it starts with ethics, it starts with finding the right level and balance between regulations and innovation, and of also, more importantly, trying to bring different folks together to be able to create new opportunities. Otherwise, why bother, right? And so thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ray. And one thing, if I could say on closing, I'd love to see DisrupTV have a nonprofit that could do demonstration projects on these topics, because I think the way we show the future, the way we make the future, is we show it to the rest of the world. Governments are going to not be able to do it. Companies by themselves are not going to be incentivized to play with others. But if you have a nonprofit that brings them all together, maybe we need to have the disruptive nonprofit for the future forward.
I love that.
Foundation. Well, hey, thanks a lot. We'll see you guys back in the green room. So
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's fascinating. It's fascinating, and for me, it feels early to me. It's amazing to talk about SpaceCloud and being able to modify software and have interoperable apps and communication done in a fraction of a time in space. What are your thoughts about what we learned over the past hour? It's really just incredibly interesting to me.
I was very inspired by all the possibilities, but I also realized that we've got a lot of work on Earth that we've got to take care of. And I think a lot of it is really, we've got to figure out how to bring people together. We've got to figure out how to have a little bit more tolerance and patience and diversity of thought, because, in order to do something like this at human scale for humankind, it's going to be very hard, right? If we can't get people to agree on some basic principles, some norms, and to agree to disagree on where things could go, right? And I think we're in the process of that. We've been going through that over the last 2 years, trying to understand where people come from, why people think differently, how people are pursuing or viewing things. And, we're still struggling to do that.
Yeah.
So It's really making me think about, the geopolitical impacts of where we are today, and if we can't get energy and the cost of energy and food down to a point where people can survive and think about higher level things, we're going to be in a lot of trouble, and we're seeing that right now with inflation. And so I hope we find new opportunities in space. I hope they are opportunities, back to what each of the panelists talked about, that allow us to take care of Earth and take care of people here first as well on our way there, and use that as other opportunities to pursue, what our framers really talked about, the pursuit of happiness, right? Whatever that may be for you, like how do you get there? And I think that's the ultimate noble goal. But sorry to go meta and deep on you there, Vala.
You're tying space to our founders. Wow, that's pretty awesome. Okay, were you surprised that 3 people that are studying space and trying to shape the future of space, all were somewhat reluctant to travel to space when given an offer with, either Musk or Bezos? and then I ask you the question: which one of the 2 options would you choose, if at all?
I think the options. I think it was not the thrill of traveling to space that was holding them off. I think it was really the offer, and I think I would might say they would all love to go to space, but each one had a different answer to address what it is. Maybe someone should go first, or maybe it wasn't the right individual at that moment in time, or maybe it was not the right moment in time. For me, I would want to go into space, right? And to do that, I would go as soon as Elon gets into space. I'll go. That's my sign that it's safe. If he's not flying it, I'm not going. At least if Bezos, he went up on his own, right? That's different. So, but until Elon gets on one of his own craft, I'm not ready to jump onto his.
But undoubtedly, he has the most time-tested, most mature. I mean, he's got a 10-year head start.
Willing to get on their own craft.
yeah. Drinking your own champagne, I guess. Okay. I would go with SpaceX, just because I believe that they have the best engineering and the most time spent developing the capabilities.
More missions, more launches.
I mean, again, a 10-year head start, I would say. But it would be a longer trip. So maybe I do what Dr. Bray said. I donate the trip to favorite charity. Okay, next week, episode 284, we have Sudesh Nair, CEO of ThoughtSpot, as our guest. We have Mike Frazier, Vice President of Sustainability Development at Schneider Electric, a world leader in terms of understanding and innovation in sustainable energy, and John Baird and Edward Sullivan were the co-authors of Leading with Heart and the importance of compassion as a core trait for successful leadership. If it's Friday, it's DisrupTV. We welcome you to join us again next week, as we have 4 extraordinary executives and authors who are going to expand our space, our minds.
We'll see Lindsay and David in the green room, and thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Cheers.